The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
My baby dolls, we are back again. Another episode of Genesis. As always, I am your host, Ian Kahanowitz, and today we're continuing on another subject that is one of my favorite, 19th century baseball. And we got Chip. Well, actually, his real name is Brian, so we'll go Brian in quotations. Chip Martin is back to talk to us about the great Detroit Wolverines, who won that 1887 15-game marathon, and it took place, folks, 2 weeks in October.
The World Series, yeah.
Yeah, it took place, almost like an Olympics. And we're going to get to Chip. We're going to get to the story of the Detroit Wolverines. Book just came out within the last 6 months, I think. Go out, get the book. It's by McFarland. Great baseball company. Chip's been in journalism forever. He was an investigative reporter. The guy, he researches and digs and digs and digs into the bottom of the barrel. He gets great information from his research. I admire his research. His books are not very long to read. They're well written. They're easy to read. And if you like the 19th century baseball topic, buy all Chip's books, and that's Pud Galvin and the Tecumseh baseball teams. And we've done shows on it before. We're going to do another show about the origins of baseball, and we're going to find out how Canada, was a big part of it. And, I just have a great time speaking with my Canadian brother from the North. But before we get to Chip, I'm going to break the station identification. You are listening to the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. And, of course, our fearless leader, the Zigzag Man, Ralph Tycho himself in sunny Alameda, California. He's our producer. And you know something, folks? We're expanding. We have brand new shows. We got Lenny Randall. We got Peter Golenbach. We got Hal Bach. We got Mark Littell. We got myself. We got Oakland A's baseball with Nancy Finley, who's the niece of Charlie O. We got Bill Cachetas. He does a hell of a job in Philadelphia. And now we are going to be going live. And that's right, folks. We're expanding across the nation, not only podcasting, but now radio broadcasting on Sports Byline USA. I'm in the middle of producing the show, and along with Ralph, and we're going to get content done, and we're going to get sponsors, and it's going to be a great talk show, pretty much what we do here, try to educate the listeners and expand baseball history and the truth. That's the more important part of it, the truth, not the stuff that TV feeds you or maybe ESPN feeds you. We're not biased in any way. We're not getting a dime from anyone to tell us what to say or do or what programming to run. And that's why I have so much fun on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. So when Ralph says, hey, Genesis in the Zone, I'm comfortably zoned. And Chip, well, he's been a great part of the show for a while, and, he lives in London, Ontario. I have a friend who moved to London, Ontario, went to law school with me. He's a member of selection committee of the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame. Maybe I'll get in there one day. And the Society for American Baseball Research. And without any further ado, welcome to the show, Chip.
Thanks, Ian. Great to be here. Nice to talk to you again.
It's nice to talk to you. I look forward to these excursions, man. You and I, we could talk for hours. You know what I mean?
We're like a couple of schoolgirls when it comes to baseball, chatting away.
Except the baseball players don't look as good as the guys that the couple of schoolgirls are probably looking at. And speaking of one guy that, probably didn't look as well in his later years, but probably was a good-looking guy in his youth, was Frederick K. Stearns. And before we even get into a discussion about the importance of him with the Detroit Wolverines, I want you to give a little background about Fred, because, again, it's in your area here, because Pud Galvin played in Buffalo, and he was born in Buffalo, and he moved to Detroit. So go ahead, Chip.
I'm missing a little bit. You wanted me to give us a little background, get us up to the point that Fred Stearns gets involved in the team?
You got it.
Okay.
Give us a little bit background on Stearns, what he did, why he got interested in the Wolverines, and why he would spend all this exorbitant amount of money with little return on investment to produce a winner in Detroit.
Well, Fred, as you pointed out, was born in Buffalo. His father moved the family over to Detroit, the other end of Lake Erie, and his father became involved in the pharmaceutical business. And there were a lot of natural salt deposits in the Detroit area, and pharmaceuticals and chemicals and solvents and that sort of thing were, used that as one of their raw materials. And anyway, Fred Stearns' father, who is also named Fred, built this rather significant drug company, Stearns Pharmaceuticals. It was second to Park Davis Drugs, which is still around, Park Davis is. And anyway, Fred was sent off to University of Michigan in the 1870s, and he became captain of the baseball team there, and he was a very avid baseball player. He gets back to Detroit, and he's working for his father's company, and the Detroit Wolverines had joined the National League in 1881. The mayor had decided that it's time that Detroit was a big league city. It might as well be in the big league, so they joined the National League at the time. And they weren't doing that well, quite frankly. In 81, they finished fourth their first season, and then they were sixth in 1882, and then in 1883 they slipped to seventh, and by 1884 they were last place, eighth. They weren't doing very well, and the mayor finally washed his hands of the team, and Frederick Stearns, who wanted to bring a winner to Detroit, became a member of the board of directors and eventually became president, decided that Detroit needed a winner, and he was going to do whatever it took to bring Detroit a winning baseball team. And he was a ball player himself. I think he was an infielder at the University of Michigan. And he decided that he was going to bring a winner to Detroit and do whatever it took. He was sort of like an early-day George Steinbrenner. He was a very powerful figure, and he had a lot of supporters. And Fred Stearns decided to dig into his pocket, and he had personal service contracts signed with players. The league at the time was struggling financially, and they were trying to put a limit on player pay. Fred Stearns said, no, we're going to get the players anyway, and he signed them to personal service contracts so he could get around the cap, and basically brought some of the top players of the day. Starting in 1885, the team was really struggling, and Stearns wasn't very happy about it. Over from Indianapolis comes a guy named William Watkins. They were in the Central League, and they were a pretty good team over there, but the league was quite weak, and the Indianapolis team came over and tried to buy Detroit as a way of getting into the National League because it looked like their league was going to collapse. Frederick Stearns and the other directors turned the tables on Indianapolis, and they said, no, we're not selling. In fact, we're buying you. And so they bought the whole team, lock, stock, and barrel. This had never been done before, a whole franchise bought by a major league team. And so they decided that, well, what do we do? The rules at the time said that when your players become available, that they have to have 10 days that other teams can come and make them offers. What happened is Fred Stearns and the manager from India wanted to consummate the deal and didn't want all these other managers that were hovering around to scoop up these players. The best one of them was Sam Thompson, who was an early slugger and really good with the bat, and he was the star of the team. And Detroit needed some additional personnel, so basically what they did the most outrageous thing. They put the players they just acquired on a boat and sent them out of the site of land and had them go cruise around for 10 days. Now they gave them food, they gave them drink, they gave them playing cards, they gave them chips, and that sort of thing, and entertained them royally as best they could, although some of the players, after a few days, were getting a little restless. They didn't know where they were. We still don't know whether it was Lake Michigan, Lake Erie, Lake Huron perhaps, Lake St. Clair, Lake Ontario, some lake that was large enough that they couldn't see land. And the boys, they said, well, we want to get off here. The skipper says, no, my rules are to bring you back to Detroit after 10 days, and you'll sign your contracts there. And the players looked around, and they thought about a mutiny, and then they realized they were all farm boys. Many of them had never really been on much of a ship before, and they didn't know where they were, didn't know how to run a ship. So they said, well, okay. So they drank up and played up and carried on. They were delivered back to Detroit Harbor on the 10th day. The manager was sitting there with contracts, had them sign all their contracts, and the team was acquired. All the players signed the contracts with Detroit and became Wolverines. Well, this was kidnapping. If they tried this today, a team would be up on kidnapping charges for taking 10 days cruise of this with people that didn't really want to be there. Bottom line is that this is how they got away with it. There were no charges ever preferred, and they became Wolverines. A little later in the year, the same year, as Stearns is trying to continue to improve the team, they bought the Buffalo franchise, which was in the National League, and it was really struggling financially. They could hardly attract any fans at all, and so they bought they really only wanted the big four players, the best batters. There was Rowe and Bruthers and Deacon White and Hardy Richardson were the big four, and but the Buffalo owners said, no, you buy the whole team. So they bought the whole team. And they tried to do the same thing again, and the National League says, whoa, just a minute, and other teams wanted to get these players because the Big Four were really a star attraction. Well, this time, the Big Four wanted to play in Detroit, so with the connivance of the Detroit club, one of the directors of the club had a lodge at the north end of Lake St. Clair, which was a sort of a fishing and hunting paradise. They took the players and they shipped them up there and hid them out for 10 or 12 days in order to get past the deadline. Ultimately, the National League says, no, we're going to have to make a final decision on this, and it wasn't until a couple months later the Big Four and the Detroit players were all allowed to join Detroit. But it worked out because that was in '85. The very next year, they placed second to Chicago in the National League with the arrival of all the new talent, and 2 years later, in 1887, they won the National League pennant and the World Series.
And you know something, what people don't understand is today Stearns will be thrown into Stern because that's tough. You know what? Hey, depending upon the legislation, where you reside kidnapping legally is when you realize that you're being held against your will.
Yeah, and I doubt these were much in the way of swimmers, and when you can't even see the shoreline, you're captive. You might as well have bars around you. But the thing is, all my research, I couldn't figure out for sure. In the paper at the day, they said they were all taken by rail to Lake Ontario and then went through the Thousand Islands and were out on Lake Ontario. Well, Stearns himself said later, no, it was Lake Michigan we shipped them out on. And it might have been Lake Erie or Lake St. Clair, which were actually a fair bit closer to Detroit. No one knows for sure. Depending on who you talk to, they weren't sure where they were. All they knew is that they were held against their wishes, and in the end, it all worked out okay. But there would be serious police investigation today if you tried that.
And you know something? Besides, this little black mark on Frederick Stearns because he was a businessman, and it's a little bit before actually it's during the Gilded Age. All these business owners, use ruthless tactics, to get their businesses, to be the best, especially Rockefeller. When the airplane was invented in the early 1900s, he used to have hire people to go up in a plane like Orville and Wilbur Wright's plane and literally drop hand grenades on opposing oil companies, refineries. Oh yeah, they were ruthless. Vanderbilt, all of them. They would create. What they would do is they would lower their prices to a bare minimum so they could put the other guy out of business and then buy their businesses. They would. Oh yeah.
Well, and Stearns was, he wasn't a self-made man. His father had started the company, but I mean, he was a very powerful influence in Detroit, well connected to all of the movers and shakers in the community, and his board of directors was like the blue chippers of Detroit. And he was a very, very much aggressive and assertive and powerful man, and he was determined. It didn't matter. He was going to bring a winner to Detroit because Detroit was, at the time, was known as the Paris of the West. It was quite attractive, and a lot of tour boats would go there, and it had a lot going for it. And it wasn't the automotive capital yet, but it was fairly industrial, and it was a hopping town, and he was one of the hoppers.
And Detroit. I speak to a lot of people from Detroit. Carol Sheldon, who's the unofficial photographer of the Detroit Tigers and the president of the Women's Baseball Hall of Fame. She always is inviting me to Detroit. Now, for Stearns, we have to say some good things here, because Stearns also served as a trustee of the Detroit Museum of Art, which is huge. And he was the organizer of the Detroit Orchestral Association, which later became the Detroit Symphony Orchestra. Later, when he moved to Beverly Hills, again, he served on the board of directors of the Los Angeles Philharmonic Orchestra, and when he married his wife in October 1870, I think her name was, Helen Street, East Street, I think her name was, they lived in an Elizabethan home on Jefferson Avenue in Detroit. It was known as the Red Gables, and is now a historical site.
Well, yeah, he was. Now, Stearns Pharmaceuticals has long ago gone, but a lot of the buildings they had, their factories are still there, converted into condominiums and that sort of thing. But no, he was a very powerful industrialist in Detroit in his day, and he was the guy who was Mr. Detroit, and he was going to bring Detroit a winner, regardless.
And the thing is, they have two big buildings named after him: the Frederick Stearns Building, and of course his house, which is a tourist thing. But he was very smart, and this is very important, because again, you mentioned him being like Steinbrenner. Watkins, his manager, was a Canadian. He was a Canuck. Let's talk about Watkins and why he was important, and how he was like Billy Martin. His players hated him.
Well, he was from Brantford, Ontario, which is about an hour away from where I am here. And he played for a while in Canada, in St. Thomas in London, and in Guelph for the Maple Leafs, the famous Maple Leafs. And then he moved over to Port Huron, and then he got into Bay City and Saginaw, and eventually he spent most of his time in Indianapolis, actually. He had a very, very long career, and he won, I think it was 12 or 13 championships along the way, including, I think, all the major leagues, a National League with Detroit, American Association, Players League, I believe. Anyway, he was quite successful, and he was a ball player at first. And in Indianapolis in 1884, I think it was, he was beamed by a pitcher high and inside from Gene Shallix. He was knocked out. He was unconscious for several days. He came back later in the season, but he wasn't the same man, and couldn't play the game. So he turned his talents to managing, and he's one of the most successful Canadian-born baseball managers of all time, as it turns out. He was a team executive and manager right up into the 1920s. He died in Port Huron, which is just across the border from Sarnia, Ontario, and north of Detroit. But he was the guy who was acquired as part of this Indianapolis deal. Now, they didn't have to ship him out on a ship for 10 days because he approved it. He was the team owner, and if the deal came through as he'd hoped it would, he would make some money. So they didn't need to persuade him to come to Detroit. It was going to be a real moneymaker for him. Anyway, he was a very hard-nosed, he was a good manager, but he was very hard-nosed, and if he saw some indifferent play on the field, he would speak out, quite critical, and he would also fine players. He fined players here and there for, $10 here, $50 there for back talk or for not running hard to get to the base. And he was disliked. The players wanted him off the bench because he was, back then the manager was, even though he was in street clothes, was on the bench. And they complained bitterly about him. And in 1887, when they won the World Series, the National League pennant, and then the World Series, the players were really, really grumbling about him, and they thought he was a tyrant. And before the next season started, the players had sort of a strike and said, "We're not going to come back if that guy is still the manager. He's hard driving. He's very hard to work for. We don't like him." And they had a bit of a player revolt. Well, the management stood behind Watkins. I mean, why wouldn't you? He'd won them the National League pennant and the World Series. And eventually the players all relented and eventually signed. But the dissension on the bench was palpable in that 1888 season. And it got so bad they started losing. They had a bunch of injuries. The players were being fined. And eventually Watkins could take it no more, and in August he quit. He left the team, and a couple months later the team was sold off to Cleveland, and the players were dispersed. But he was a big reason why they did so well. But the players, they were still pretty wild and woolly back then, and they needed some discipline. And Fred Stearns, knew exactly that's what they needed because the previous owner, or the previous owner and director, president, the mayor, had got fed up with players misbehaving and jumping their contracts and just generally, misbehaving. And so the whole idea was to get somebody in there who was a disciplinarian. So they got what they wanted, they got the success they wanted, and then eventually Mr. Watkins paid the price. And he moved on, and he kept winning games and championships and in a very long and successful career.
Now, let me just have a little defense of Watkins, okay?
Okay.
A lot of people here today see baseball as structured. We've gone through steroid phases. We've gone through Peter Ueberroth and the cocaine testings, and we had all of this kind of rules of engagement where baseball players will do their best to be good model citizens and play the game. Now, back then, ball players, even in your quote, they were rather poorly behaved. They drank, they went with women, they gambled,
and Ian, and they kept getting malaria, and we know what malaria was.
Yeah, VD, right?
Yeah. They were bad actors.
Yeah, we got VD. They got venereal disease. So, Watkins was brought in, and he tight-fisted this behavior. And when you take alcohol away, and when you take the fun away, and when you discipline people on a game, you're earning literally close to nothing. I don't even think these guys played with gloves. I don't think they had any gloves, right?
Very few.
Yeah, I mean, and your life can be altered in one swing of the bat.
If you didn't play, you didn't get paid.
That's right. And there was no health insurance.
No.
And there was nothing, and pitchers' arms would just fall off. And we spoke about Pud. How many innings he pitched, double headers sometimes, pitched the next day. You're always replaceable. It's almost like working in a factory. Once you keel over, we're just going to get someone else. But in defense of Watkins, he did that. And I think in his first season, what was his first season, 1884, 1885?
Tail end of 84, yeah, and then 85. But, he was like Cap Anson over in Chicago. I mean, a harsh disciplinarian, not well liked by the players, but got results.
He got results, all right, because in 1886, he piloted them to an 87 and 36 record, and then came the year which we're going to talk about now, and we're going to talk about this in three parts. Number one, we're going to talk about how they made their run at the World Series. Number two, we're going to talk about why a 15-game crazy World Series, why it had to go to a 10-5 victory when they probably just won it at 6. And then, lastly, what we're going to talk about is the immediate collapse. I mean, the next year, that was it. See you later. We're out of Detroit. It's like, hey, we won it. See ya. So we're going to talk about this in three parts. And the first part is, let's build up in 1887, how Watkins got these guys in line and why they were so successful is the question.
Well, he had a terrific amount of talent. He had a great starting point. I mean, he had the big four hitters out of Buffalo. They were spectacular hitters. Hardy Richardson, Jack Rowe, Dan Bruthers, and Deacon White. Terrific talent there. He had Sam Thompson they'd acquired from Indianapolis, who was considered one of the best sluggers of all time in baseball. They had some pretty solid pitching with Weedman in there and several others. They had one of the best catchers of the day, Charlie Bennett, who to this day I think he should be in the Hall of Fame. He was with the team the entire history from 81 to 88, and Charlie Bennett had a gun for an arm. Was a pretty good bat, and he was sort of the unofficial captain of the team. He was the glue that held it together. He was also the star attraction. He's a very handsome man, and when Detroit was on the road, some of the papers would say, "Oh, Charlie Bennett and the Wolverines are coming to town, ladies. You should get out to the ballpark." So he was a bit of a draw for the team. They basically had a good bunch, a great bunch of talent, and Watkins was able to channel it and to work with it. And he'd played the game. He knew what was needed to win. He wasn't particularly innovative, but he was able to sort of bring a little bit of discipline that they hadn't had much before at all. It was the '84 team was terrible. They finished 8th in the league last, and Watson's involvement was immediately apparent. The players respected him and realized that he knew what he was talking about, and he was able to get them all pulling together in the '86 season. And at the end of that season, they finished second only to Chicago. What was happening, though, the backdrop to this whole thing was that Detroit, yes, they were acquiring all these big players and terrific talent, but they were paying through the nose for it, and the other owners of the National League teams got wind of that, and they didn't like the fact that that Stearns, like Steinbrenner, was trying to buy a winner, and money was no object, and they were trying to put a cap on player pay in order to ensure that the bottom line for each team was profitable at the end of the year. And the problem was that the National League teams were still struggling. You know, the American Association came along in 1882, was known as the Beer and Whiskey League, because basically it allowed the sale of alcohol at the ballparks and Sunday play. And the National League was dead set against it because baseball players had been wild and woolly, and they were subject to being bought off by gamblers, and their behavior was terrible, party animals, that sort of thing. And so the National League was trying to bring some discipline to players and to the business of baseball and to regulate it. And Watkins was right in that way of thinking. So he was sort of carrying out sort of the Victorian sort of work hard, keep your nose to the grindstone, don't misbehave, and play the game. At the time, the American Association, the Beer and Whiskey League, was profiting handsomely. They were owned by saloon keepers and brewers and that sort of thing. And they also had the Sunday games, which, even though the Watkins brought some success to the team, and, you could understand why people would stay away for an 8th place team, 7th or 8th place team. The problem was, even when Watkins had them all performing at their best, and they wound up finishing second in the National League, there weren't many people coming to the ballpark. And I believe the reason is they were in the wrong league. They should have been in the American Association. They should have been in the Beer and Whiskey League, because Detroit, working class town, a lot of industrial businesses, 6 days a week working, 10, 12-hour day work weeks. The only time that people would have time to come out to, the general public would have time to come out to ball games would have been on Sunday. And yet, because of the National League and this sort of Victorian approach to things, they couldn't have Sunday games. So they never really developed a strong following, despite the great work of manager Watkins in 1886 and bringing the team a second-place finish. So there were a number of things beyond just his managing well that were at work, which ultimately paved the way for what ultimately happened.
Let me ask you this about the American Association and the National League. They did have magnets, owners. They like to call them They like to call themselves the magnets.
Yeah, they did.
Yeah, I don't know why.
We have to spell that out for your listeners. It's magnate, Nagnate, not magnets like North-South Pole.
Yeah, they like to be called the magnates.
Yeah. And
the thing is, you had the Beer and Whiskey League, which is so much they profited. Like that guy Ahi out in St. Louis. He was
Chris Vonderau. Yeah.
He was huge. I mean,
he was a saloon keeper, and he made an early connection between beer and baseball. Duh, and that's why he was profitable.
And there was, and something, he was probably like George Steinbrenner in the American Association, and the association was very profitable until I think what was it, the early 1890s. I think it faded away along with the Brotherhood.
After the 91 season, it faded, and 4 of their top teams went over to the National League, and the American Association was gone. But they were profitable right from day one, whereas when Detroit joined the National League in 81 and right up till 88, the National League teams, Chicago was the only one that was consistently profitable, sometimes Boston, but the rest of the teams struggled. They were the business model for baseball was still being refined at the time.
Yeah, and the thing is, the National League was created probably 11 years before the 1887 World Series. It was created in 1876,
yep.
I believe. And the thing is, This smells like 1967 in the United States, where the American Football League is taking away money from the National Football League. So let's get a game going and call it the Super Bowl, and let's, have contracts on this, and let's get some money going. And eventually, within a couple of years, you'll be part of the National Football League with all the teams merging, and we pay you off. Now, again, it took 4 years after the first Super Bowl for that to happen in 1970. American football merged the two leagues after an agreement in 1966. We're talking 1887 here, the Wolverines, when they played the St. Louis Browns. How did the two leagues come together and decide, look, let's have a 15-game World Series? Well, I know they did for money, because all this stuff is done for money.
Well, yeah, exactly. Well, here's I believe the first World Series, and it was called the World's Series, not World Series, as we say today, and they sometimes called it the World Championship. But I believe the first one was arranged between the winners of the National League and the American Association in 1882, possibly 83. And the idea was, at the end of the season, because there were two rival leagues out there, the end of the season, who was going to have bragging rights. And so this thing started, and it changed every year, and it was always toward the end of the season, the leading team in the one league would approach the leading team in the other league and say, do you want to have a World Series, a World Championship after our pennant race is over? Because once the pennant race was over, I mean, you didn't have playoffs in the National League or the American Association. The team that finished first was the champion. There was no playoff series like we have today for everything. So they were looking for one more bit of possible of glory, and so they decided to do this, and you're exactly right, Ian. They decided they needed to do it to make some money. And the series, as I recall, would be best 3 out of 5, best out of 7, that sort of thing. And in 1886, St. Louis was a pretty good team. Chris Von der Haar had a pretty good team, and they won the World Championship. And so Detroit is running first in the National League, running away with it, and the St. Louis Browns were doing the same thing in the American Association, and they decided, let's have a World Series again. It'll be our 4th or 5th in a row. And they decided, because Detroit was struggling financially, there was an issue about the gate sharing that we can talk about at some point. Detroit was struggling financially. They were doing well on the field, but they were struggling financially. They just couldn't put enough bums in the seats. And so the two of them, Von der Haar was a great one, a great capitalist, anything to make money, and Stearns the same thing. So they decided, well, we've got this idea. Let's have a really long series so we can make a lot of money here. Detroit really wanted to boost the end of the year, profit situation, which was doubtful at the time. And so they decided upon a 15-game World Series. And this was going to be sort of never been done before. It was 15 games, and it was decided that all 15 games would have to be played. It didn't matter if after 8 games one team was ahead and had won the majority of the 15 games. It didn't matter. They were going to play all 15. They were also going to take it on the road, and they were going to play in all the best cities that they could draw crowds in. The idea was to maximize the gate. They weren't going to play half the games in Detroit because the gates weren't all that great in terms of Detroit. So they went on the road, and I think at the end of the day, of the 15 games, there were about 4 played in St. Louis. There were some games for other venues, but they were canceled, and then they had to fill in with an extra game in Detroit and an extra game in St. Louis, as I recall. And anyway, they took this show on the road, and they drew some pretty good crowds along the way. But after the 11th game, Detroit was in the driver's seat. They had basically won it. There was no way that St. Louis could. They continued to play, and by the 15th game, first of all, it's late in October. The weather is cold. The game meant absolutely nothing, as the previous 3 or 4 had meant nothing. And I think there was something like 600 people at the ballpark on the very last game, and I can't even remember if it was in St. Louis or where. No, it wasn't in St. Louis, but at any rate, it was 600 people. And at the end of the day, it was a financial success, but the thing went on and on and on and on. It was sort of the longest baseball season ever, and it was the first and last time they ever did a 15-game World Series, and insist that they play all the games and that they move them around in order to maximize revenue. At the end of the day, it was profitable, certainly for Detroit. It certainly helped their bottom line, but the problem continued into the next year, and ultimately they had to pull the plug.
Well, let me ask you this. Here's something odd that went on. That has shut the city of Woodstock, Ontario down. Let's talk about that.
I'm sorry?
They had to shut the city of Woodstock, Ontario down during the World Series. Didn't they?
I don't remember that, Ian.
Yeah.
During that World Series of 1887? Well, okay, now, yeah, well, that's maybe a bit of an exaggeration. The star player, that's right. The star player for the St. Louis Browns was James Tip O'Neill, and he was a native of Woodstock and had played in Woodstock and was quite the star player. And he had batted something like 400 during the season and won most of the batting categories and was a big reason why the St. Louis Browns had done as well as they had done. I forgot about the excursion trains that came down from Woodstock. Yeah, they loved their Tip O'Neill and he was their star. However, in the World Series, Detroit, largely because of Charlie Bennett, St. Louis was a great base stealing team and a great hitting team. And basically, Charlie Bennett, the catcher, shut down the base stealing in the running game. And Tip O'Neill, I guess maybe too many people came down to watch him from his hometown. Maybe he just had anxiety, and maybe he just had performance problems. But for the entire series, he only batted about 200, and he's one of the reasons that St. Louis was beaten up so badly by Detroit over the course of the series. So Tip O'Neill, he's also in our Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame. Was a terrific baseball player, and each year the outstanding Canadian in the major leagues is given the Tip O'Neill Award in his honor, and Joey Votto keeps winning it the last few years. But yeah, Tip O'Neill he just choked basically, and was one of the reasons that Detroit was able to prevail over the St. Louis Browns, who were a very, very strong team and were looking for their second World Series championship in a row.
Now let me ask you this. They're on top of the world, the Wolverines. Detroit must be ecstatic. People are running the, recreation park is now put on the map. Why is Stearns leaving the Wolverines?
Well, Stearns became very busy with his business. His father retired and turned the pharmaceutical business over to him. And Stearns, I think he realized that they threatened to go to the American Association at one point over the issue of gate receipts, that the owners of the other teams in the National League decided that rather than give these guys, visiting teams, a 30% share of the gate. Detroit was always a great draw on the road, but they couldn't draw fans at home. So they were living off their proceeds from the road, and some of those proceeds were going toward paying these players more than the other National League owners were comfortable with, and basically they couldn't compete at paying the rates that Stearns was paying. And so it was a tough go financially. Eventually, Chicago and I think another team decided to go back to the 30% share, but the other team said, no, $150. You show up in our park, it doesn't matter if we get 10,000 fans, you get $150. No gate splitting with us. So financially, they were struggling. Even though they were champions of the National League and they had won the World Series, they were struggling financially. And I think Stearns realized that, at one point he threatened to jump to the American Association because of this treatment, which had promised him the 30% share and would also let him play a ball on Sunday and maybe sell alcohol at the ballpark. I sort of wish they'd jumped, because who knows, they might still be around today. Regardless, financially, they were struggling, and in 1888, they were struggling on the field. They were doing very, very poorly. They finished fifth ultimately, and things just weren't happening. There was maybe 1,000 people, 800 coming out to the ballpark, Recreation Park, which was described as Harry Wright as one of the best ballparks in all of North America, and they couldn't put people in the seats. And so I think the Detroit director says, oh, well, it's not going to happen, and now Stearns is leaving us to go back to his business. They decided to cash in, and they sold the franchise to Cleveland, and the players were dispersed. And at the end of the day, the Detroit directors, like Stearns, they made a pretty penny, but they just weren't willing to keep struggling and trying to make a go of it, especially when the city of Detroit just wasn't behind them in significant numbers to make it a real ongoing success.
Now this thing, well, let's get some numbers first before I get into the revenue sharing here. Now, the numbers that were concocted, and again, we don't know if it was real, we know that it was hearsay, was that the shareholders who invested in the Wolverines lost $15,000 during the last season and $58,000 during the 8 years of the Wolverines.
Well, yeah, that was put out for public consumption and for justification for pulling the plug. You may recall, Ian, in the book, Stearns was accosted on the street after the sale by a reporter, and who was trying to commiserate with him for losing all this money. And Stearns was grinning like a Cheshire cat. They made out like thieves. He acknowledged how much money the directors had made by virtue of the sale. So, those numbers you mentioned there, I think those were ones put out for consumption and to explain what they did, to justify what they did. But I don't believe that they were accurate.
And then now you have this revenue sharing, and Stearns wanted 30% of it.
He wanted to keep the existing plan, which was visiting teams in the National League would receive 30% of the gate revenue for each game. And in order to penalize Detroit for spending so much more money under these personal service contracts, Arthur Soden, who was the owner of Boston, he was the one that came up with this scheme that they're gonna pay for this. He was very tight-fisted, Soden, and he didn't pay very much at all. He didn't like spending. When he walked, he squeaked. He was very, very tight, and he came up with this plan, and with some other owners, that we'll give them a $150 flat fee. It doesn't matter if we put 10,000 people in the seats, 15,000 people, 8,000. The flat fee for visiting teams will be $150. And that was targeted specifically at Detroit, which was one of the best draws on the road, but did very poorly at home. Boston, for instance, would go to Detroit, and when only 1,000 people show up, and you only get 30% of it, that's not very much money, and might even be below the $150 amount at sometimes because of the poor draw. And basically, they felt that Detroit was living off the proceeds of traveling, and it wasn't doing enough to promote itself at home and to draw enough people out that visiting teams that it would be financially to their advantage to visit Detroit, even though the league said they had to. So this whole notion of cutting them back to 150, previously, on good days, Detroit could walk away under the 30% scenario with, $2,000 or $3,000 on a good day, and compare that to $130 or $150. It's a huge difference, and it made a significant impact on the bottom line of Detroit. Now, as I say, Stearns threatened to jump to the American Association to get better treatment over there where they had the 30%, and had to be talked out of it. I'm not sure how serious the threat was, but had to be talked out of it, and Spalding over in Chicago and I think another owner in New York, if I recall, agreed to continue on at the 30% rate. Don't tell anybody. We'll keep giving you the 30% because we like having you in the league. We don't want you to leave the league. It'll hurt the league. So they made this little side deal with him to continue on at the 30%. So a couple of the teams, possibly three, continued on at the 30%, whereas three or so only gave them $150 upon appearance. So there was a significant impact on Detroit's bottom line.
And you know something, it kind of ushers in what's going to happen within the next few years. As you mentioned in your epilogue, you said, look, baseball was still being refined in these years. The people were coming and going, and teams were coming and going, and the rule changes would come in 1889. They would tinker around with the balls and strikes.
Oh yeah, if I can recap that a little bit, because Detroit played at a very interesting time in the creation of baseball as a business that we've been sort of focusing in on. But as a game, from 1881 to 1888, when Detroit was around, in 1881, the pitching distance had just been increased to 50 feet from 45 feet. 7 balls were needed for a walk. 84, you ended the restrictions on pitching delivery, so you could pitch overhand now. It had to be underarm or sidearm before that. 6 balls for a walk in 84. 1885, 7 balls for a walk. 87, 5 balls for a walk, 4 strikes for an out, and a walk was scored as a hit, believe it or not. For instance, 1888, the last year that Detroit played, they finally settled on 3 strikes for an out, and walks were no longer recorded as a hit. And it should be noted out that the pitching distance of 60 feet 6 inches wasn't established until 1894, so 1893, 1894. So it was a slightly different game. If we were to go to the ballpark and watch one of their games back then, we'd see some significant differences from today's game.
And also, what happened is the reserve clause really reared its ugly head around the same time as Cap Anson and his gentleman's agreement. But the big thing was, a maximum of $2,500 for ball players a season.
Yeah.
And that just went up. John Ward, who would end up doing the Players League, went up his butt sideways, and it pretty much was the first labor walk in baseball.
Oh, the ball players absolutely hated the reserve clause. They likened it to slavery, and to recap, it basically said that once you're with a team, unless they decide to let you go, you're property of that team as long as you are playing ball. And the players absolutely hated that, and had a depressing effect on salaries. I mean, it was the opposite of the bidding wars of today. And the players unionized, the Brotherhood of Professional Ball Players unionized, and then became the Players League in 1890. And they wanted to show that the ball players were still in charge. Well, that didn't work out too well, but they made their point, and labor was quite restless back then. Yeah,
and that's pretty much where this whole thing ends. And what would happen with Detroit? Because you mentioned here a couple of things that happened within the next coming years, there would be other baseball teams that would pass through.
Well, Detroit was without a real professional league team for a number of years after the Wolverines pulled out. And in about 1894, there was a team that was established, played in the Western League, as I recall, and it was known as the Creams. And the owner, Vanderbeek, said, we're calling them the Creams because they're going to be the cream of the league. Well, that name didn't hang around too long, and in fact, there was a military unit in Detroit known as the Tigers. And I don't know how it came to be, but they started calling the team the Tigers. And they became a founding member of the Western League. Ban Johnson came in and sort of converted the Western League into the American League, and Detroit became a founding member of the American League. And it's interesting that they moved to a ballpark in the 1894-95 frame, Michigan and Trumbull Avenues, and it was an old Haymarket, and the first name they put on it was Bennett Park, in honor of Charlie Bennett, the very popular catcher from the Wolverines. And Charlie Bennett, after his time in Detroit, he went to Boston, and in 1894, he was on a hunting trip out in Kansas, and he fell off a train. He was trying to jump on a train that was leaving the station. He fell beneath the wheels. He lost 2 legs. So he had artificial legs, but didn't stop him. He settled in Detroit, and until he died in 1927, I think it was, every day he threw out the first pitch, and the ballpark was known as Bennett Field in his honor for the longest time. So the legacy of the Wolverines lived on that way. Today, the only remnant you'll see of the Wolverines is a plaque where Recreation Park used to be. In 1894, it was torn up, and housing was developed there. And today, it's on the campus. The plaque marking where the ball field was is on the campus of the Detroit Medical Center. And that's about the only reminder that people have of the Wolverines, other than people hearing about, Bennett Park. And it was an interesting time in the city history. And a lot of people, to this day, view Detroit as an American League city. Well, it wasn't always that way. It was originally a National League city, and it was actually a National League championship city, and it was a World Series champion as well. And it was a very short time frame, 1881 to 1888, but it was a fascinating story. We had the kidnapping, we had, terrible play, we had a bouncing of manager, we had a Steinbrenner come into the picture. It's a great story, if I may say so, of an interesting time in baseball history.
And, as for the city of Detroit, a lot of people don't realize, today, Detroit is pretty much a shrinking city, a city that since 1950 people have been moving away. You know, you could see the depression that, they had 2 million people, I think, in the city in 1950. Now it's less than 750,000.
Yeah, I think you're a little high on 51, 52, somewhere in there. It was like 1.7 million, and it's like 750,000 today. Although it's showing signs of comeback, and I get down there from time to time, and there's a lot of, basically the real estate values got so low and the land prices became so low. In fact, it's an opportunity now for investors, and there's a lot of significant investment going into the Detroit core. High-rises are coming, residential condominiums. I mean, the old Hudson's department store, which was an iconic building of 22 stories or something like that in downtown Detroit, which was imploded in 1998, and it's been a concrete pad ever since. There's an 800-foot building that's going to go on that site, a mixed retail residential thing. There's lots and lots of money. Ford Motor Company looks like they're moving into downtown Detroit. One of the rumors is they're going to take over the long dormant Michigan Central Depot, railway depot, and which is an iconic eyesore of derelict Detroit. And there's all sorts of energy that's occurring in downtown Detroit. You've got the Comerica Park, you've got Ford Field, and now the Little Caesars Arena, all quite close to each other, all drawing good crowds. And there's a new energy in Detroit, and I'm kind of excited about it because I'm only 2 hours away from it. And for a time there, 60s, 70s, 80s, it was a pretty scary place to go to, depending on the time you were there and where you went. But there's a real energy in Detroit, and I'll tell you, the people have responded to my book about the Detroit Wolverines. It's amazing. A lot of people know a little bit about the Wolverines and their interest in the team and the baseball history of Detroit. Detroit's a great baseball town, I got to tell you, and I'm thrilled to give the people down there something to read about the great baseball history.
And I had Tom Stanton. I don't know if you know who Tom is. He's a writer of baseball too. He's written a lot of books. He's from the Michigan area. He wrote 2 years ago Terror in the City of Champions, and it took place in 1934 and 1935 in Detroit. People forget Detroit was the fourth largest city before the Depression.
Oh, it was. Yeah, it was a happening place, and a lot of Detroit was built when Detroit was a fairly affluent city. If you look around, you don't have to look too far to find a lot of really spectacular architecture, public buildings, private buildings. I mean, the city was laid out quite well by Judge Woodward, and it's got some very nice parks. It's got some really nice areas. It's sort of had a few decades of difficulties, but it seems to be emerging from all that. And Detroit, the history is sort of, it's had its ups and downs. And what I like reading about and learning about the Wolverines is it was really on and up. The future was all ahead for Detroit, and there's a lot of positivity in the city at that time.
And one of the things people don't realize is it's part of Eastern Standard Time. It's not part of the Central Time. Detroit is a Midwestern city with a Northeastern mindset. They consider themselves just like more of New Yorkers than they would of Chicagoans.
Well, I live right between New York State and Michigan State here, where I am, and there is a difference in attitude between New York people and Michigan people. Yeah, definitely it's part of the Eastern Time Zone. But, way back when, Detroit was considered a city in the West. Chicago and Detroit were considered Western cities. I mean, Detroit was known as the Paris of the West. When Boston was well established and New York and Philadelphia were all well established, you were really getting out into the Western hinterlands when you were getting out to Detroit and Chicago. But that's no longer the case. But yeah, there's a difference. And I think we're seeing it politically with respect to the Trump phenomenon, comparing Michigan and New York. And I see it myself when I visit. There is a difference in attitude, and that's just the way it is. But yeah, it's definitely an Eastern Time Zone city, and the time zone changes just this side of Chicago as you're traveling west, and it's kind of fun. It's around Michigan City, Indiana, is where it changes when I'm coming from where I live over to Chicago, and we get a kick out of trying to figure out whose cell phone is showing the time change first.
Well, Chip, I had a great time with you today. Is there something you want to mention that maybe I didn't get to today?
No, Ian, you read books, you read my books, and you ask intelligent questions. You cover it really, really well. I appreciate you. I've done a number of podcasts and radio interviews over the years, and Ian, you are a top-grade interviewer. You've got a great enthusiasm for the subject. You read, you do your homework, you do a terrific job, and I hope we can talk again at some point. I think you do a terrific job, and it's an honor being on your program.
Well, sir, you're too kind. I'd like to consider myself, a song and dance man like Mr. Bojangles, Lawyer, one thing, producer of a radio show, another, talk show host. I try to do my best, and
you do a great job at it, Ian. So keep on keeping on, my friend.
Oh, yeah, you are just too kind. It's not me that does the great job. It's you folks who have to answer my questions and think outside the box sometimes. That makes the show worthwhile, and I learn something new every day I do a show, and that's the point of it, because like my listeners, and no matter what research I do or prepare for a show, there's always something new I learn here. So. And
the same with me. I love learning, and I hope we've shared some interesting stuff with your listeners, because you do a very, very good job, and you and I can talk about baseball like schoolgirls all day, and it's a lot of fun. So thank you so much for what you do.
Well, we're going to get you on the show. You'll get me the book on the origins of baseball.
Baseball's Creation Myth. Yeah, my first baseball book. It's still around, and we'll get your copy, and we can talk about that.
We'll get that copy, and then of course next year when your book comes out, Brother Matthias, who was the mentor to Babe Ruth and the whole Baltimore and St. Mary's school down there, we'll get you back on the show, of course. And we'll do that program because that's a subject that needs a little bit more explanation, especially in the realm of baseball and Babe Ruth. And we'll see how that life was around in Baltimore at the turn of the century to the teens when Babe Ruth was there.
Super. I look forward to it, Ian.
So we'll do that. So hold the line. This is how I end the show, as you well know. Folks, go out. Detroit Wolverines. You can get it at McFarland. You can get it on Amazon. And do you have a website, Chip?
No, but it's widely available. For me, I don't have a website, but any online, just punch in Google Detroit Wolverines, and that should pump up. And if it doesn't, Detroit Wolverines, the rise and wreck of a National League champion, 1881 to 1888.
It's a fascinating detail. Again, touches on subjects of Buffalo. And if you do that, go look at Chip Martin's other book on Pud Galvin. Also, the Tecumsehs, which is very, very important as well. These books are very well written, very well researched, very enjoyable to read. I had a good time reading them. I even have a better time talking about them. I'm fortunate enough to do that. And I know you folks at home or in the car or wherever you're listening to me will like it as well. And so I'm Ian Kahanowitz. You are listening to Genesis. I'm signing off from the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. Thank you, Chip, for being on the show. You're a blessing to this show.
Well, thanks. It's a pleasure being with you, Ian.
And, in the immortal words of my hero, who I never got to see because he died 5 years before I was born, Edward R. Murrow, good night, folks. Good luck. We'll see you next time.